So I hope you guys are going to start using Eventbrite. I personally use it for most of the events that have Eventbrite, and I've had quite a good experience with it. And Reno is a great guy, so if you have good heart behind a great company, it's really easy to use their product. The same goes for me with Andreas Ehn, who's our next speaker. He used to be, so everywhere on this website for BDL Accelerate, it says ex-CTO of Spotify. And I was standing there, I'm like, okay, so he's an ex-CTO, but what does he do now? So I talked to him for a bit, and he is something that I would call a serial startupper now, and he has his own startup and is working on some new inventions, and I hope you guys, he's gonna walk you through the journey of how to be a successful CTO, but also how to be an entrepreneur and run some startups. So Andreas, please come on stage. Can I get a clap? Awesome.
Thank you.
Does it work? Just want to make sure.
I think it does work.
Awesome.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right? Great. So good to see all of you here. Feel almost like the boss on that big stage. So many people. First time for me in Beirut. Very exciting. Very thankful to have the opportunity to come here. So I'm going to talk based on my experience primarily from two startups, the startups where I spent most of my career. The first one is Spotify, which I assume most of you know of. How many are using it, even though it's not actually available here in Lebanon? So quite a few, yeah. How many are using some other music streaming service? A few more, yeah, I know. Spotify should come here. But it's arguably the most successful startup to come out of Stockholm, Sweden, where I'm from. It's helped put Stockholm on the map of startups. It's got some impressive numbers. But it all started, like any company does, very small. So this is like the original Spotify team. I got involved because I worked together with Daniel, one of the co-founders, the guy in the middle here, at another Swedish startup called Stardoll. So we were doing very different stuff. We were doing paper dolls online, digital paper dolls targeting primarily girls aged 7 to 12, roughly. So eventually we kind of amassed 200 million users and had 1 billion daily page views. It got pretty big. But I got to know Daniel there, who was consulting as a CTO, and I was initially a developer and then engineering manager. And we started talking about what would eventually become Spotify in the spring of 2006. So Spotify was started more than 10 years ago. And it wasn't even that clear back then that we were going to do music at all, or that music would be the focus. The initial conversations were around building a video streaming service. And even after the company had got started, we were still considering a video streaming service. It was only after we kind of had recruited the team and started really building things that we finally decided that we were going to do music. I think it was a good decision. No one has really done a Spotify for video yet. I think it would be a great product, but no one has been able to get anywhere near the sort of licenses you would need to get to build something that would have essentially any video content, the way Spotify and other music streaming services have essentially all music content. So we started building Spotify, as of August 2006, roughly. And it's gotten quite far. The company has raised a lot of money. Last priced equity round was about a year and a half ago, for about an $8.5 billion valuation. But when we started, there were a few other commercial music services out there, but we didn't really look to them for inspiration because none of them were particularly successful. At the time, a lot of people were already listening to music online, but 98% of that music was pirated. No one paid anything for it. So rather than focusing on competing with the existing services for those remaining 2% that actually did pay for music, we wanted to attract those 98% who didn't, but did want to listen to music online. So the benchmark we set for ourselves wasn't other existing music services, it was the file sharing networks. How many of you have heard of the Pirate Bay? Yeah. So two music startups, if you will, came out of Stockholm, Sweden, Pirate Bay and Spotify. I don't necessarily think that's a coincidence. So that's what we saw as our competition. And it wasn't because we were out to kind of kill piracy or anything. We didn't mind piracy particularly, but we did want to give users a better experience. And I think that's key to Spotify's success, that focus on product and the user experience. So one metric we set for ourselves was any stream should start playing within 200 milliseconds from the user hitting play. So that's really fast. It feels instant, and like that's sort of the metrics that we measured ourselves against and the engineering standard we put up for ourselves. Of course, sometimes you'll have network latency that's longer than that, and there isn't much you can do, but at least, and even then there are things you can do, because if you expect the user to listen to that track, you can start pre-buffering and things. So I think the focus on product was a big part of Spotify's success, and I think that's why it remains the most successful music streaming service, even though it's up against enormous competition like Apple Music. But of course, you don't get everything right. So we did a lot of things, especially on the tech side, that we probably wouldn't do today. So we built a lot of things ourselves. For example, we hosted our own servers, initially in our office and eventually in co-location centers. And Spotify still today has thousands of servers streaming all that music. Today you would never do that, right? How many of you have your own machines at all? Yeah, how many use like a cloud service, something like Amazon or exactly. So that's what you should do today. And there's so many other things you don't need to do yourselves anymore that we had to do. So we spent tons of time configuring those servers and finding the right co-location centers. We built a lot of internal technical operations tooling that you can just get off the shelf now. We built a peer-to-peer network, a peer-to-peer streaming network, and we got a lot of attention for that and a lot of credibility. And it probably helped us recruit some really good developers, but it was eventually, ultimately, I think it was a big waste of time. It made everything much more complicated around the streaming infrastructure. And today, the utility of that is essentially gone, and it's being phased out at Spotify, especially with the transition to mobile phones. So when we started Spotify, it was before the launch of the first iPhone. No one had, there were already smartphones, and we were building Spotify mobile apps, but we were building them for things like, Symbian or Nokia Series 60 platforms. And no one had been able to anticipate the enormous shift in our industry to smartphones. So Spotify was, by definition, not a mobile-first company. It was a desktop-first company, if you will. So web and desktop was the focus back then. But I think we were able to shift very quickly. So when the first iPhone came out, the 2G iPhone didn't even have an app store. Apple's stance at the time was you should build web apps. So you can put small icons for your web apps on your iPhone home screen, but you can't build native apps. And there was no distribution of native apps. But of course, hackers thought that we should definitely build apps for the iPhone. So they reversed engineer it. They jailbroke it. People published documentation for an SDK through the reverse engineering. So we started building the first Spotify app even for that first generation iPhone, even though we knew we would never be able to distribute it commercially, but just to kind of learn and be there when that shift happened. About a year later, the 3G iPhone came out with an app store, with a published SDK, and we ported the Spotify app to that and launched it. So we were very early. I think we were also one of the first customers, if not the first, to use Android's native development kit, so we could port our C++ streaming library to Android. So we were early and saw the shift to mobile, which I think is also key to why Spotify remains successful. It could easily have been left in the backwater by some other startup doing essentially the same thing, but who would have had a better or an earlier mobile product. Okay, so to summarize, five learnings from Spotify that I think are applicable to any startup. One, build a great team. That's key in any company, really in any project you set out for yourself. You can't do it alone. You need great people. We spent a lot of focus on recruiting. We definitely wanted to hire the very best developers in my case, but also all around the company, the best people we could find. In general, just try to find people who are smarter than yourself, better than yourself at doing things. You can't do everything yourself. And you're not going to be the best at everything. Secondly, build a great product. I think product matters a lot. I think Spotify's focus on product is one reason why it's become so successful and it remains successful. That doesn't mean you should over-engineer things and wait too long. It's also important to get things out to the market and test things. And you should be quick and fast-moving, and your development should be iterative. But you still need to care about quality and focus and polish and those last small details. Users will notice, and users will love your product if you love it. Now there's a great quote by Reid Hoffman, who invested in my other company, and he said, like, if you're not embarrassed by your first product, you waited too long to launch. And I do believe that to be true also. So I'm not saying, I'm not saying you shouldn't get things out the door quickly. You should, but you should also make sure that eventually you can be proud of that product. Thirdly, embrace what users want. So this is, I think a lot of people start companies and try to change user behavior. And in a sense, Spotify did change user behavior, but we did it by looking at how people were already using music online and trying to make something which embraced what they wanted, but did it better than the existing solution. I think that's key to success. You should question prevailing assumptions. So it took 2.5 years for Spotify to get those music licenses. And that's like, no one had been able to do it in that way before. But we didn't give up. We could easily, at any point during those 2.5 years, said, okay, this is not going to work. The music industry is just not ready for this. Because it wasn't ready. It took a long, long time to shift it to a point where it was ready. And lastly, you need to stay on top of tech shifts. Like, this industry changes very quickly. Like I said, the transition to mobile could easily have left Spotify behind. It didn't, because we were early at embracing it. Right, so eventually I left, and everyone asks me, like, why did you leave? Why did you leave Spotify? So I might as well answer before someone asks that question. To me, the company, I left after about 3.5 years. So the company had about 150 employees when I left. So it was already big, not compared to how big it is now, but it was already big as a startup. I like the early days. I like when you're starting out and building something new. You're building something from scratch that has never existed before, and you have a small team, you know everyone, decisions are fast and easy. I don't think I'm a big company person. So I left eventually to start another company, which is called Wrap. Wrap was originally a social gifting service, we used to call it. So it was essentially a way for you to give free gift cards to your friends. Could be on their birthday or for any reason, really. So people like free stuff. People used it a lot. The reason why we could give away those free gift cards was because the retailers would sponsor them. So for them, it was a way to get people to come into their store. The person who received such a gift card would eventually come into their store. So this was sort of on the tail end of Groupon's success. And we thought, okay, Groupon didn't work for most types of retailers, but no one has still really cracked the problem of offline bricks and mortar customer acquisition in a smart way. So and 90% of retail is still offline. So it's like 10x the opportunity of e-commerce. So we thought we had a way to do that. And investors agreed. We raised a lot of money. We got people like Nicholas Sandstrom, who started Skype, is now running Atomico, and Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn and is now at Greylock, to invest and join our board. We raised a lot of money. It all looked like it was going to be very successful. But with the success comes competition. So just shortly after we launched, we heard that Rocket Internet was launching a clone, like literally a exact clone of the business model, the app, everything we were doing. Even like their FAQ had been like copy-pasted from our website, including spelling mistakes. So it's quite blatant. Probably a lot of you know how Rocket operates. And I have a lot of respect for what they've been able to do, especially in like many parts of the world where other startups or where other big companies don't go, at least not that quickly. But it's slightly annoying when you're up against them, and they're of course super aggressive. They were saying they were going to raise 50 million euros and launch this product in 30 countries. They were telling everyone it was their idea, so on and so forth. So we decided to fight them. So at the time when this happened, we were a small team only in Stockholm, and 3 months later, we had people actually like feet on the ground in 18 countries all over the world. And of course, this was very costly. We had 70 employees. We were burning through like $1.5 million a month. Had essentially no revenue, so completely unsustainable. But that's what we did. And we had a lot of support from our board who also weren't happy about Rocket, and they were like, okay, you should go get them, you should go beat them. Eventually we did beat them. Very costly affair. Eventually we did beat them and like the 20 or so other clones we had all over the world. Unfortunately, we beat them with the wrong model in retrospect. We didn't know that at the time, but the model wasn't really working. It grew very quickly. We had millions of users. Like quickly, we had 10% of the Swedish population as our users, because the model was super viral. The only thing you could do was spread it to other people. But it didn't work out for the retailers. They weren't happy with the people who eventually came into the doors. They got a lot of like freeloaders, so was just looking to get stuff for free, and didn't end up being that good customers, or even if they were, we didn't have the data to prove because we could only see what happened during the first transaction. So we scaled back quite drastically. We eventually closed down our US operations. I had, during these years, moved to San Francisco to head up rap over there, but we closed down our US operations, at which point I also left the company. We scaled back to eventually just one country, Sweden, and now it's like in 2 or 3 countries. And pivoted the product. So the new wrap product is a card-linked offers product. So you link your credit card, and based on your spending pattern, you get various rewards and offers from retailers. So for the retailers, which are still trying to solve the same problem, getting people in the door, but from the end user, it's a very, very different product. And the company is moving at a much slower pace now. It has raised another round of funding after this, and it's able to get the product out in a few markets, but it's very, very slow to work with banks. It's nowhere near that sort of viral growth that we had with the original model. But at least it's surviving and it's working. So 4 learnings from my rap journey. The first one is to stay focused. I would say it's very dangerous when you let your competitors drive your strategy. In retrospect, I think we would have been better off just focusing on our original launch plan, which was launch the product in Sweden, make sure it gets successful, iterate the product, and then when we know we have a good working product, then launch it in the US, which we saw as our next market. Instead, we were led on this crazy journey across the world and burned a lot of cash that we could have used better. Secondly, it's very, very hard to run geographically distributed teams. So you meet many startups all over the world, and they all want to go to San Francisco. They all want to go to Silicon Valley, and they set up an office there, and we did. And it's very hard to run the teams across, in our case, 9 different time zones. For Lebanon, it would be 10 different time zones. It's very hard. You don't have a lot of overlap in a day. So I would definitely say try to keep your team in one place. Or if you need to go to San Francisco because Silicon Valley is your market, if you're building, say, a product for other technology startups, then try to move the whole team over there. Don't try to be in 2 places if you can avoid it. It's very hard, very challenging. Thirdly, don't rely on partners for distribution. This is a mistake we did repeatedly, so we never learned, apparently. We had big partnership projects going with Apple, with Facebook, with Google, with PayPal, with American Express, and we spent a lot of time on it. But what happens with these projects is usually that those big companies, they might be running like 10 different such projects with different startups, and maybe one, maybe none of them actually pan out. So for them, it doesn't matter. They have so many resources. They can have 10 people sitting in those meetings all day. But for you, they lock up all your resources, and you don't get anywhere. So it's very dangerous. You also see startups that do this a lot, that kind of, if I just get this partnership, then my distribution is solved. They'll distribute it to all of their customers. That rarely works. You need to be in control of your own distribution plan. You need to have your control of your own channels. And lastly, product market fit can have false positives. Now, a lot of people reading like all of these startup blogs, they read about product market fit. You get to iterate until you're product market fit, and then you can invest in growth. And that's true. Like, it's a good model, but it's often not that simple. It's not like this holy grail of the product market fit doesn't exist. Typically, like we thought we had product market fit with Wrap. Turned out we didn't have it because it wasn't sustainable. So we needed to find a new one. Maybe we have it now. So what I'm saying is, like, you will constantly keep iterating your product, even when you have seen that it works for a market and it is working. You are starting to scale out a lot. You will still need to keep focus on that product market fit because people change, markets change, so it's not forever. And even if it looks good, it might not be sustainable. So eventually I left Wrap. Now what do I do now? Stayed on in San Francisco for another year, and then together with my wife, we started this slightly odd project we call Approach. So we realized we're sitting here in Silicon Valley, it's amazing, it's a great lifestyle, but all of these companies, all of these investors are not really looking at what's going on in the rest of the world, and there's so much exciting stuff happening outside of Silicon Valley. So we wanted to learn more about that. So Approach is our personal learning experience, basically. So the plan is we're going to live in 10 different countries over the course of 5 years. So we're spending 6 months in each location. The countries we picked are roughly the 10 biggest economies of the future, measured by GDP adjusting for purchasing power parity, minus the United States where we used to live. So we started out with Indonesia last year and lived in Jakarta. We're kind of based in Singapore while we do this, but now we're in Berlin. Thank you. That's all from me today.
Excuse me. I'm trying to get to you, but you're so popular that look how many people came. So
do we have any time for questions?
we kind of do. We haven't done it really, but if you want to point one question, then we can do it if you want.
We'll do one question. Who has a
Does
question?
anyone have a question for Andreas?
There's a question over there.
Hi, thank you very much for the inspirational talk. I was wondering, what's your take on lean startups? Specifically regarding, because I've been reading a lot about them, so what would you advise regarding lean startups?
Lean startups, I think it's great. I think the framework is great. We weren't very lean. We were very fat, burning a lot of cash. No, I think it's the right way to go. Like keep everything small, keep the team small. Not only because you burn less cash, but also because you can move a lot faster. Like people think they can move faster with bigger teams. That's often not the case. And yeah, iterate until you kind of validate your product against the market, until you have that product market fit. Just be aware that it might not be that. It's not going to be that simple as if that's when you read the books. The reality is a lot more complicated. But the framework is good. The framework is good as long as you. Yes, I would. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Awesome.